Christmas lights have a way of telling stories they're not supposed to tell. You look at them from across the street, and they seem warm, inviting, almost like they're calling your name. But that Christmas Eve, as I stepped out of my old F-150, I knew the lights inside my son's house weren't calling for me. The place looked perfect, wreath on the door garland, on the railing, shadows drifting across the living room like a family settling in for the night. A night I thought I was still part of. Then I saw him, a man I didn't recognize, sharp jawline, clean suit, comfortable posture, sitting in my old leather armchair, the one my family used to joke was reserved seating for Dad. He leaned back like he owned the air in that room, like he'd been waiting for this seat, for my seat. Something inside me shifted, not loud, not violent, just that quiet, unmistakable kind of pain a man feels when he realizes he's watching someone else slip into the space he spent a lifetime trying to earn. On the passenger seat beside me, the wooden toy train I carved for my granddaughter wobbled as I picked it up. My hands, they weren't shaking from the cold. It was something heavier, a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. I told myself I was just dropping off a gift, just a short visit. But as I stood at the edge of that porch, watching another man sit where I once mattered, one thought hit me harder than the winter air ever could. If they could give my chair away so easily, what else of mine had already been taken? The snow had been falling since late afternoon, drifting slow and steady the way it does when the world wants to quiet itself down. By the time I turned onto Daniel Street, the houses were glowing so with Christmas lights. Every porch, every window, every trimmed bush seemed to promise warmth, the kind that used to mean something when my name still had a place in that house. I parked my old F-150 by the curb. The engine rattled twice before settling into silence. I stayed inside for a moment, letting the heater fight a losing battle against the cold. On the passenger seat lay a small wooden train I had carved in my workshop. It was meant for my granddaughter. I had imagined her holding it, turning the wheels with those small hands of hers. That image had kept me company the last few nights. When I stepped out, the air bit at my face. I walked across the yard, boots sinking into soft snow. The wreath on the door felt out of place, too polished, too magazine perfect. I raised my hand to knock, but stopped. The window beside the door told me everything before a word was spoken. A man I had never seen sat in my old leather armchair. Ryan, I would learn later. He wore a dark suit that did not belong in a modest Missouri living room. Yet he looked like he owned the place. He leaned back with one leg crossed, one arm draped over the side of the chair, the same chair where Daniel used to crawl into my lap after long days of hauling freight across state lines. The same chair Brooke never let anyone else sit in because it was Dad's seat. Now it was his. The door opened a crack. Daniel stepped out. He kept his head low, hands deep in his jacket pockets, breath fogging in the cold. He did not step forward. He only stood there like a boy caught between two hard choices. "Dad," he said quietly, "tonight is not a good night. Mom wants a quiet Christmas. No tension." He said it soft, almost apologetic, but the words hit with a kind of cold I had not felt in years. I glanced past him. Brooke was inside laughing at something Ryan said, her hand resting on his arm for balance. It was a laugh I had not heard from her in a long time. Not when we were together. Not even when we divorced. Daniel reached for the gift I brought. His hand shook a little. He said he would give it to her tomorrow. I nodded. Sometimes a man chooses silence because anything else would break him in half. The door closed before I turned away, a little too fast, a little too final. I started down the walkway, the snow crunching under my boots. I told myself to keep moving, keep breathing, get to the truck. Yet halfway there I stopped. A voice rose from behind the door, Daniel's voice. low, quick, like a secret he wished he did not have to say. Mom said he already signed everything over. Dad knows the $1 million estate isn't his anymore. The streetlight flickered. Snow gathered on my shoulders. The whole world seemed to pause on that one sentence. Signed everything over. Not his anymore. It repeated in my mind until the words felt heavier than the winter air. I had spent 40 years building that estate. Long nights on the road, sunrises seen from a truck stop counter, miles upon miles traded for a promise that I was securing something for the boy in that house. All those years, and now I was being spoken of like a man who had handed it away without a thought. I looked back at the window. Ryan shifted in my chair, reaching for a mug Daniel had set on the seat table. For a moment, it looked like he was the one hosting Christmas, like Brooke and Daniel were orbiting around him. My place had been filled, my chair, my space, my story. I felt something in me give, not loudly but with the quiet finality of old wood cracking in the cold. The truck door groaned when I opened it. I sat down and let the heater push out its thin, warm air. The little wooden train on the seat beside me slid a bit when I started the engine. I steadied it with my hand. A man can survive the cold. He can work through storms, sleep in parking lots, rebuild a life from almost nothing. What stays with him is not the weather. It is the moment he looks through a window and realizes the warmth inside is no longer meant for him. As I pulled away from the house, snow filled the tire tracks behind me faster than I could make them, as if the world was already practicing how to erase me. Morning came in a pale wash of light that did not belong to any particular hour. It felt like the kind of gray that stretches all the way through a day before you even get out of bed. I had not really slept. I had closed my eyes, but the sound of the door closing in my face kept replaying over and over every time the house settled or the furnace kicked on. The little wooden train sat where I had left it on the passenger seat of the truck. Its edges were smooth from the sandpaper, the wheels still stiff from fresh varnish. I picked it up, turned it in my hand, then set it back down as if letting go of something heavier than pine. I started the engine. The old F-150 coughed a bit, then settled into its usual low hum. Frost clung to the edges of the windshield. I let the heater blow until a small clear patch opened in front of me. Through it I could see the world flat and cold and honest. There was no reason to wait any longer. The drive to the construction site took me past strip malls and gas stations that had seen better years. Holiday decorations still hung in a few windows, but they looked tired now, like they had been up too long. The closer I got to the site, the more the landscape shifted into open lots and steel skeletons of building shapes reaching into the gray sky without any promise attached. The site itself was already alive. Trucks moved in and out. Backup alarms chirped and the clank of metal rang out in irregular bursts. Men in hard hats walked across the muddy ground with that particular pace of people who know the cold will get into their bones and stay there all day. I parked near a portable toilet and a row of orange cones. When I stepped out, the ground sucked at my boots. Melted snow had mixed with dirt and gravel, turning everything into a slow, heavy mess. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete. Daniel was near the far side of the site by a stack of lumber and rebar. He was talking to one of the foremen, nodding, making notes on a clipboard. The hard hat did not hide the way his shoulders were set a little too high, as if he was waiting for something to drop on him. He saw me, and for a split second his face did something I had not seen in a long time. Surprise, then a flicker of something almost like relief, then worry rushing in to cover both. He handed the clipboard to the foreman and walked toward me. His boots left shallow prints in the mud. He did not hurry, but he did not drag his feet either. He moved like a man walking into a conversation he had rehearsed, but did not really want to have. "Dad," he said, his voice low so the others would not hear, "you should not be here." I let the words hang for a moment. There were a lot of things I could have said. I went with the smallest. I needed to see you. He looked over his shoulder, checked who might be watching, then motioned with his head toward a quieter corner of the site near a pile of cinder blocks. We walked there together, not side by side, but close enough that I could feel the tension coming off him like heat. When we stopped, he reached into his jacket. His fingers fumbled at first, then he pulled out a cluster of papers, folded and refolded until the edges had turned soft. "Mom showed me these," he said, eyes fixed on the ground. "She said you signed them after the surgery. She said you gave Ryan power of attorney and transferred control of the estate. She said you wanted to do right by her." He held the papers out. I took them, careful not to let my hand shake. The wind tugged at the pages, but I kept them still long enough to read. My name was printed at the top, and there it was, that signature that looked like mine if you did not know me. At a glance, it could have fooled almost anyone. At a glance. I read in silence. I could feel Daniel watching me from the corner of his eye, waiting for some kind of explosion that did not come. I remember signing a medical power of attorney before the surgery. I said, finally, still looking at the paper. 30 days, in case something went wrong. That is all. Nothing about the house, nothing about $1 million, nothing about Ryan. I lowered the pages and met his eyes. There was doubt there, but it was not aimed at me. It was turned inward, like he was questioning his own part in something he had never wanted to be part of. She said he started, then stopped. His hand tightened in his jacket pocket. She said, "You know you owe her. That she stood by you. That you were just making it fair." The way he said it, he did not believe it fully. He was repeating lines he had been given. I reached out to hand the papers back, and my fingers brushed his wrist. He flinched sharp and quick, more than a man would from a casual touch. His jacket rode up just enough for me to see the skin beneath. There were dark marks there, half moon-shaped and uneven. Not the clean line of a fall or the scrape of a tool. They were the kind you get when someone grabs you and does not care how hard. My stomach tightened. I heard my own voice, and it sounded too calm in my ears. "What happened to your arm?" He jerked his hand back, yanking the sleeve down so fast he almost tore the fabric. He took a step backward, and his boots slipped a little in the mud. His eyes flicked across the site, checking if anyone had seen. "Do not," he said the word barely more than air. "Do not ask. You do not understand what is happening. Just leave it alone." He looked up at me, then really looked. There was fear in his eyes that was clear. But underneath it, under the panic and shame, there was something else. A flash of apology, a silent message that said he did not want this, any of this, and that he was caught in something too big for him to carry alone. He opened his mouth like he might tell me more. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Then a shout came from across the site, his name carried on the cold wind. The foreman waved for him. "We will talk later," he said, already stepping away. "I have to get back." He turned before I could answer and walked off. Shoulders bent, head low, he did not look back. The papers were still in my hand. They felt heavier than any load I had lifted in that old trucking yard. I folded them once and slid them into my coat. The print smeared a little where my thumb pressed down. I stared at the ground for a while, at the pattern of boots and tire tracks pressed into the mud. The sight buzzed around me, but it all sounded distant, like I was standing behind glass. A low engine rumble pulled my attention to the far edge of the lot. Beyond the fence, near the access road, a black Range Rover sat parked in the dirty snow. Its paint was too clean for a place like this. The windows were tinted so dark they almost swallowed the morning light. The front window rolled down a small amount, not enough to see a whole face, just the outline of one. A shape in the shadow. I could not make out his eyes, but I did not need to. I felt the same crawling sensation on the back of my neck that I had felt outside the house the night before. I stood there not moving, and for a few seconds the world seemed to hold its breath. The car did not honk or flash its lights. It just idled, humming low like an animal watching from the tree line. Then the window slid back up. The Range Rover eased forward slow and smooth, turning toward the road that would take it away from the site. It left behind 2 dark tracks in the slush and mud, perfectly spaced, cutting through the mess of other prints. I walked back to my truck. My hands found the steering wheel and stayed there a moment before I turned the key. I glanced once more at the place where the Range Rover had been. The tracks were still there, clear and deep, while the rest of the ground was slowly turning into a blended gray. As I pulled out, the sound of gravel under the tires echoed louder in the cab than it should have. The sight shrank in the rearview mirror until it became nothing more than color and motion. The only thing that stayed sharp in my mind was the look in Daniel's eyes and the marks on his wrist. Snowmelt dripped from the hood in thin lines, sliding down and disappearing into the road. The sky stayed dull and flat above the highway. Ahead of me, the day was waiting wide open, but it felt like I was driving into a tunnel, walls closing in with those 2 tire tracks from the black SUV still etched in my mind, as if the ground itself refused to forget who had pressed down on it. The road home felt longer than it ever had, even though I had driven it hundreds of times. The sky stayed the same dull gray that had followed me from the construction site. Every few miles, a streak of melting snow slid down the windshield, leaving thin, crooked lines that caught the light before disappearing into the wipers. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on the folded papers in my coat. They felt warm now, warmed by the anger rising slowly in my chest. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch light was still on from the night before, and the snow around the steps had already begun to melt into shallow puddles. I sat in the truck for a long minute, letting the engine idle. The wooden train shifted slightly on the seat, catching my attention. I placed it in the glove compartment so it would not slide again, then turned off the engine. Inside the house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes a man hear things he usually ignores, like the faint hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the hallway clock. I took off my coat and draped it over a chair, then walked toward the room where I kept old boxes stacked knee-high along the wall. They held pieces of my life that I never seemed to have time to sort through. Retirement accounts, property deeds, sale documents from the trucking business, old bank statements, tax returns that went back a decade or more. I knelt down and opened the first box. Paper rustled as I dug through it. My fingers left faint marks on the dust that had settled on everything. I was looking for something specific, though. I did not know exactly what. A clue, a memory, a contradiction. Anything that would tell me how a stranger had managed to slip into my life and take my name out from under me while I was still breathing. One folder caught my eye. It was thinner than the rest, tucked between a stack of retirement filings and an envelope filled with receipts from the year I sold the business. The folder was old, its edges curling slightly. Inside it were documents from the year Linda died. Hospital bills, insurance forms, the death certificate. My breath slowed when I touched them. There were things in that folder I had not let myself look at in a long time. When I lifted the stack, something slid loose and fell to the floor. An envelope, aged, yellowed at the corners, sealed but worn. My name was on the front in handwriting I knew better than my own. Linda's handwriting. Sharp strokes, light curves, the way she always wrote my name when she was trying to calm me down after a long week. Under my name was a line I had never seen before: for John, if something ever happens to me. My hands went still. I sank back on my heels and let the envelope rest in my palms. The paper had softened with time. The ink had faded slightly, but the outline of her letters was clear. I could almost see her sitting at the old kitchen table as she wrote it, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. I sat down on the floor and opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines, but every line landed with the weight of a decade. John, if you are reading this, I need you to be careful. Ryan Mercer came to me in 2012. He said he had a trust plan that would protect you if something happened to me. He wanted me to shift everything out of your name. I refused. He did not like that, not one bit. Never trust him. I read it again, then again. Each word tightened something inside me. The room seemed smaller, the ceiling lower. I heard her voice in the back of my mind saying those same words. Never trust him. Ryan had been around that long, not just this Christmas, not just after my surgery 12 years ago, back when Linda was still alive, still healthy enough to see through him. Back when I was too busy hauling freight and keeping a business alive to notice someone circling my family. I folded the letter slowly and held it against my chest. The air felt heavy. I remembered the year 2012 with a clarity that hurt. The long nights, the strain of running the business, Linda telling me about some insurance agent who kept pressuring her, saying he could make things easier for us. I told her to ignore him. I had no idea who he really was. I stood and moved to the dining table where the light was better. I spread out the documents, laying the forged papers next to the letter. Seeing them side by side made something settle in my mind. Mercer had not appeared in our lives by accident. He had been waiting for a moment when no one would question him, waiting for a weakness, waiting until I was half asleep in a hospital bed, drugged and groggy, signing whatever they put in front of me. The clock on the wall ticked in long, steady beats. The sound echoed in the quiet. Outside, a truck passed on the road, tires hissing on the wet pavement. I heard it fade into the distance, but the weight in my chest did not move. I kept thinking about Daniel, the way his eyes looked when he said I did not understand, the bruises on his wrist, the fear he carried like a shadow. If Mercer had been around since Linda's time, then he knew our history. He knew where the cracks were. He knew which people were easy to pressure and which ones were easy to replace. I looked at the chair across the table. Linda used to sit there. I imagined her watching me now, arms crossed, head slightly tilted, the way she did when she wanted me to figure something out on my own. I whispered into the empty room, "Why did you wait to tell me this?" No answer came, only the soft hum of the heater kicking on. It pushed warm air through the vents, stirring the papers on the table. The edge of the letter lifted slightly before settling again. I picked it up and read the final line one more time. Never trust him. I set the letter down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the window. Snow had begun to fall again, thin and scattered. The flakes drifted past the glass in uneven patterns, some sticking for a moment before melting into faint droplets. Mercer had not come into my family by chance. He had come with intent. He had come with a plan. He waited through years of silence, watching for an opening, and found it when my guard was down and my son was vulnerable. The thought settled deep, colder than the air outside. I gathered the papers, placing the forged ones beside the letter. I folded them carefully and tucked them back into the envelope they had fallen from. Then I stood and walked toward the living room where the lamp cast a warm circle on the floor. The house creaked once in the quiet, as old houses do when something shifts, slow and subtle. I stood there a moment, listening to the faint movement of the settling beams. Then I set the envelope on the table beside Linda's photograph. The snow outside thickened, soft flakes gathering against the window. I rested my hand on the back of a chair and stayed there in the stillness. The room felt smaller but clearer. A piece of the puzzle had landed exactly where it belonged. I breathed in slowly, letting the weight settle in my chest. Outside, the snow kept falling. It drifted across the yard in thin white sheets, soft enough to look harmless, steady enough to cover everything if you let it. The envelope still rested on the table beside Linda's photograph, the edges stirring slightly in the warm draft from the heating vent. I stood there long enough for the air to grow still again, long enough for the weight of what I had learned to settle deep in my chest. The quiet of the house pressed in around me until I felt the need to move. I took my coat from the chair, folded the letter into the inside pocket, and stepped outside. The cold hit with a clean bite. Frost clung to the railing of the porch, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I walked to the truck, opened the door, and let the engine turn over beneath a heavy sky. The plan formed by itself, one step leading into the next, the way a man moves when he is done being confused and has decided to start collecting truth. The first stop was my former attorney's office. The building sat in a brick strip just off the main road, wedged between a shuttered sandwich shop and a nail salon with its lights still off. I parked under a bare tree, its branches scratching against the roof when the wind moved. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee grounds. Mark Delaney came out of his office with reading glasses perched low on his nose. He had gained weight since I last saw him, a softness around the middle that suggested long days behind a desk. He extended a hand and looked at me with the kind of concern reserved for old clients who show up without an appointment. "You doing all right, John?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I reached into my coat and handed him the folded papers I had taken from the construction site. He glanced over the top page, then motioned for me to follow. We sat at the small table in his office, the kind used for signing documents and going over insurance claims. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin bars of light across the stack of papers. He read quietly, his finger tracing along the lines of legal text. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "This medical power of attorney you signed," he said, tapping the page. "It expired after 30 days. That was standard for pre-surgery authorizations. No one could have used it to move your money. Not legally." I let the words wash over me. They confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them out loud tightened something in my throat. He kept flipping through the pages. His brow furrowed deeper with each one. Then he sat back. "These copies are barely readable," he said. "Looks like they were scanned and reprinted a few times. Someone used this to get financial access." He pushed the papers toward me with a sigh, the kind a man gives when he realizes something ugly has been unfolding right under his nose. "You need to talk to your bank." The bank sat across town near the grocery store, a squat building of tan stone with a small parking lot already full. I walked inside past a woman wrangling 2 restless children and an older man holding a stack of deposit slips. The branch manager, a man named Stevens, met me near the teller line. He recognized me immediately and guided me to his office with an uneasiness in his step. His office smelled like old carpets and peppermint candies. Framed certificates lined the wall behind him. He asked what he could help with, and I placed the forged documents on his desk without a word. His face paled as he read. He clasped his hands together, knuckles whitening as he tried to steady his voice. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "I am ashamed to admit this, but we accepted these." The man said he was acting as a family representative. "He said you were too ill to come in. Our teller should have checked the original, but she did not. I should have followed up. We failed you." It was not anger that came over me then. It was something colder, a slow sinking feeling that told me negligence could be as dangerous as malice. I asked how much was moved. He glanced at his monitor, swallowed, then answered. 320,000. It was transferred into an administrative holding account tied to an LLC. The account is frozen now. I can get you the paperwork." He stood and left the room for a moment. I sat in the quiet, watching dust particles drift through the light from the window. When he returned, he placed a folder in front of me, the papers still warm from the printer. I thanked him and left. The hospital was next. The parking lot was half full, nurses in scrubs walking briskly through the biting wind. I passed through the sliding doors and the familiar smell of antiseptic and warm air hit me. Memories came with it, the beeping monitors, the ache of drifting in and out of consciousness, the heavy fog of anesthesia. I found the nurse's station near the surgical recovery ward. A woman with tired eyes and a loose bun looked up when I said my name. She hesitated, searching her memory, then nodded slowly. "I remember you," she said. "I remember something else, too." She motioned for me to follow her to a quieter corner. Her voice lowered. "There was a man who came the day after your procedure," she said. "He said he was your son's older brother. He had some insurance forms. You were groggy." "I was overwhelmed that day. We were short-staffed. I let him bring the papers in for you to sign." She rubbed her forehead, guilt visible beneath her exhaustion. "I should have checked more carefully." I asked her what he looked like. She described a man with sharp features, dark jacket, confident posture. I knew immediately. I thanked her and stepped back into the cold hallway, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I made my way to the elevators, past rooms filled with quiet machinery and muted voices. For a moment, I could almost see myself lying in one of those beds, half awake, signing something that blurred under the weight of anesthesia while a stranger stood beside me, pretending to be part of my family. The forensic handwriting expert's office sat on the edge of town in a converted garage with a small sign in the window. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and old paper. A woman with sharp eyes and steady hands took the documents from me. She led me to a table covered with sheets of handwriting samples and magnifiers. She studied the signature with a quiet patience that spoke of years spent examining lies written in ink. She circled parts of the signature with a pencil. Then she looked up. "This is not natural handwriting," she said. "It is a reconstruction, traced. The pressure is too even. The strokes are too consistent. I see signs of digital cleanup. These lines here, these breaks, they would not occur in a live signature." She tapped 11 separate points on the page. "There are inconsistencies throughout. Whoever made this knew what they were doing, but they did not know enough." I thanked her and stepped back into the late afternoon light. The sun was setting behind a bank of clouds, tinting the sky with a faint orange that barely warmed the air. I sat in my truck and laid the documents on the seat beside me. Piece by piece, it all aligned. Mercer had taken my signature when I was too weak to defend it. He had told the hospital he was family. He had told the bank I was too sick to come in. He had forged authority with patience and precision, waiting for the right moment when no one would question him. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let the silence fill the cab. There was no more wondering why this was happening. The question that rose instead was quieter, heavier, and far more real. How much had already been taken? Outside, the last trace of daylight slipped behind the clouds, leaving the world in a muted gray that settled over everything. The parking lot lights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the hood of the truck. I watched the shadows shift as the wind moved soft and steady and let the quiet settle deeper, holding the weight of what I had learned. Night settled over the house in a slow, quiet way. The parking lot lights from the hospital had faded behind me long ago, but their cold glow still felt lodged somewhere in my chest. When I stepped inside my home, the air was dim and still. I did not bother turning on anything more than the small lamp above the kitchen sink. Its weak circle of light barely reached the table, but it was enough. I pulled out a chair and sat down. The wood creaked under my weight, the same tired sound it had made for years. The house around me was silent, yet I could feel something shifting beneath that silence. I rested my hands on the table, fingers spread as if bracing for something I had been avoiding for too long. The day had taken pieces out of me. The forged signature, the nurse who remembered the lies, the bank that let my name be pushed aside, the way Mercer moved through each institution like he already belonged there. But none of it weighed as heavily as the thought of Daniel, his bruised wrist, his shaking voice, that look in his eyes when he tried to warn me without saying the words. I let out a long breath and leaned back. The kitchen was dim enough that the shadows on the walls looked stretched thin and uncertain. I opened the drawer beside me and took out an old laptop, the one I rarely used anymore. Dust clung to the edges of the keyboard. I brushed it away and powered it on. The screen glowed slowly, almost reluctantly. I clicked through folders until I reached a small archive labeled personal. Inside were hundreds of emails, some from the trucking company, some from Linda during the years when we were trying to rebuild our marriage, some from Daniel during college, short messages with updates on classes or money he needed for textbooks. I opened one at random, then another. I kept clicking, moving through years in a matter of seconds. Then I saw an email labeled Tuition Assistance 2011. My hand hesitated above the mouse before opening it. The message was short, a thank you, sent from Daniel's college email, addressed to someone named R. Mercer. I opened the attachment, a scanned receipt, $50,000, tuition paid in full. My breath stilled. I scrolled further, more receipts, payments made directly to the university, each signed with the same initials, each stamped with the same date format, each coming from an account tied to the same name. I sat back hard enough that the chair legs scraped against the floor. $50,000. Paid when Daniel was 21. Paid at a time when my business was barely staying afloat. Paid during the year when I told Daniel he might have to take out another loan. A year when I was hauling freight through snowstorms and sleeping in the cab of my truck while Mercer was wiring money into my son's future. My jaw locked. Not from anger at Daniel, from something much deeper. A slow realization that carried its own weight, filling the kitchen like a cold fog. I had left a door open. I looked out the window toward the dark yard. The glass reflected the faint circle of the kitchen lamp and a tired version of myself sitting beneath it. I remembered the missed baseball games when I picked up extra shifts. The birthdays when I called from rest stops off I-70. The graduations I watched through a phone screen because I could not get out of a delivery contract. I worked hard, but I was gone. Always gone. And while I was gone, another man stepped in. I opened more emails, messages Daniel had written late at night. Notes about classes he struggled with but never sent to me. Replies from Mercer giving advice, offering help, promising support. They were not the messages of a stranger. They were the messages of someone who had been building trust, one small gesture at a time. A man who positioned himself as reliable, present, available. I rubbed my hand over my face, the stubble scratched against my palm. There was a pull in my chest I had not felt in years. The kind that makes a man understand the full cost of choices he thought he made for the better. I clicked open the oldest message in the chain. Daniel had written, "I do not want Dad to think I am asking him for more money. He is already stretched thin. I do not want to bother him." My throat tightened. I closed the laptop slowly and let the room sink back into its soft darkness. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above me, flickering once before returning to its dull glow. I saw it now, all of it. Mercer had studied the gaps in my life, the cracks in my family. He had waited until the distance between me and my son was wide enough for him to fit through. Then he filled that space piece by piece until Daniel leaned toward him without realizing it. The betrayal was not Daniel's. It was mine. Years of absence had carved a path straight through my son's life, and Mercer had walked it like he had been invited. I felt something warm gather in my eyes and blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. They rolled slowly, not from anger or shock, but from a grief that had lived quietly for years without a name. One tear slid down my cheek and landed on the wooden table. It spread into a small circle before turning into nothing. I rested both hands on the table and bowed my head. The room felt smaller than ever, but the weight inside me was shifting. The sorrow remained, but beneath it something steadier began to form. A quiet strength I had not felt in a long time. Not the force of a man fighting for money or property, but the resolve of a father who finally saw the truth. This fight was not about reclaiming $1 million. It was about reclaiming the son I had lost long before this Christmas. Reclaiming trust. Reclaiming a place I had abandoned without meaning to. The kitchen light flickered again. Outside, the wind pushed against the siding of the house, a slow, steady movement that felt like a reminder. I stood and walked to the window. The glass was cold beneath my fingers. The darkness outside seemed deeper than before, but there was a small comfort in knowing I could finally see the shape of the enemy. And the shape of my own mistakes. The yard was quiet. The snow lay still. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then silence returned. I stayed there with my hand on the glass and let the stillness settle around me, a quiet pause before whatever waited on the other side of the night. My hand stayed on the cold glass longer than it needed to. Outside the yard was still the snow holding its shape in the thin light from the porch. Inside the house hummed softly. The fridge motor, the heater pushing air through the vents, the small sounds of a life that had kept moving while I had been somewhere else. I pulled my hand back and reached for the phone on the counter. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then moved with a kind of steady resolve I had not felt in years. I scrolled through the contacts until I found the name I knew I needed. Mark Delaney answered on the second ring. His voice was rough with the kind of mourning that comes after too many late nights at a desk. I told him I needed to see him, today if possible. He did not ask for details on the phone. He just told me to come in. The drive to his office felt different this time, not heavier, sharper. The streets were wet from snowmelt and the sky hung low. But there was a line inside me that had finally straightened. I walked into the brick building and smelled the same faint coffee and paper I had smelled before. Mark met me at the door to his office, glasses in hand, tie loosened. He looked at my face for a moment before speaking. "Sit down, John," he said. "Tell me everything." I laid it all out on the small table between us. The forged power of attorney, the bank transfers, the nurse who let a stranger into my hospital room, the letter from Linda, the bruises on Daniel's wrist, the emails about tuition and favors. I spread the documents like cards in a losing hand. Mark listened without interrupting. He read each page, his brow tightening, his lips pressing into a flat line. When he finished, he set the last paper down and leaned back in his chair. "This is not a family misunderstanding," he said quietly. "This is a criminal setup. We are going to move fast. We freeze everything in your name before he has a chance to touch another cent." There was no drama in his voice, just a matter-of-fact clarity that felt like a hand around a rope in the dark. The next 2 days moved in a blur of signatures and waiting rooms. Mark filed for an emergency order at the courthouse. I watched him move through hallways and offices with the speed of a man who had done this before. Forms were signed, affidavits prepared. A judge reviewed the stack of evidence in a chamber that smelled like old wood and older decisions. Within 48 hours, a clerk handed Mark a stamped order. Every account and property tied to my name was frozen. Mercer could no longer move money with my forged permission. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something other than helplessness. It was not comfort. It was not victory. Just a sense that the ground under my feet had stopped shifting. The hearing itself was set for the end of the week, a courtroom in the county building downtown. When the day came, I stood outside the doors for a moment, watching people file in and out. Some looked scared, some looked bored. Justice is not kind or cruel. It is just a place where people bring their broken stories and hope someone is listening. Inside the courtroom was bright with artificial light. The air was cool and dry. Wooden benches lined the back, worn smooth by years of use. I sat at the front table next to Mark. Papers were stacked neatly in front of him. He adjusted his tie and gave me a small nod. Across the aisle, Mercer sat with his own attorney. He wore another one of those suits that seemed designed to catch light. His posture was relaxed. One arm rested over the back of his chair. His face was smooth, almost bored. Brooke sat behind him, hands twisted in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel sat a few seats away from her, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. The judge took her seat. The room settled. The handwriting expert was called first. She walked to the stand with a file pressed against her chest. Under the bright overhead lights, the enlarged images of my signature were displayed on a screen. She spoke calmly, pointing to each part of the forged strokes, explaining how the pressure was too even, how the line weight did not match human motion, how small digital artifacts suggested the signature had been lifted and rebuilt. It sounded clinical, almost cold, but each word pressed on the truth I already knew. My name had been cut from one life and pasted into another. Mark asked careful questions. She answered them without flourish. Mercer's attorney tried to poke holes, suggesting that signatures can vary, that age and illness can affect handwriting. She did not flinch. She returned to the evidence, to the 11 points she had marked, to the science of forgery. When she stepped down, the room felt different, less abstract, more sharp. Brooke was called next. She moved to the stand as if each step took effort. Her hair was pulled back, but strands had worked loose and framed her face in a way that made her look older than her years. She placed one hand on the rail as if to steady herself. Mark approached gently. He asked her about the forms she had signed, the ones Mercer had given her. Her voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the air between them. He told me they were consents, she said. Just paperwork so the bank would have everything in order. He said you had already agreed. He said if I did not sign, he would tell Daniel about the gambling debts. He would tell you. He would tell everyone. Her eyes filled, but she held herself together. She admitted she had hidden those debts for years out of shame and pride. She admitted she had believed Mercer when he told her this was the only way to protect the family from the fallout. She had not read the fine print. She had trusted him to tell the truth. Mark did not push beyond that. The damage was clear enough. The judge watched with a face that gave nothing away, but her eyes stayed fixed on Brooke with a focus that told me she was listening. Then it was Daniel's turn. He walked to the stand with a stiffness that reminded me of the first time he stepped onto a baseball field in front of a crowd. His hands shook as he was sworn in. When he sat, he kept his eyes on Mark as if looking anywhere else would make him lose his balance. Mark asked if he had received messages from Mercer about me, about the estate, about what he was supposed to say. Daniel nodded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of printed pages. His fingers fumbled a little as he handed them over. These are copies of the texts, he said, voice rough. From the last year. The judge reviewed them, then allowed Mark to read portions into the record. The words filled the room in a way that made the air feel heavier. Mercer had threatened to ruin Daniel's credit, to call his boss and suggest he was unstable, to make life difficult on the job site, to cut off any help he had given in the past. All if Daniel did not keep repeating the story that his father had already signed everything over to his mother, that this was only about fairness, that questioning it would mean betrayal. Brooke closed her eyes, her shoulders sagged. Mercer did not move. When it was Mercer's attorney's turn, he tried to paint the messages as frustration from a man who had invested time and money into a family that did not appreciate him. Daniel sat through it, eyes lowered, until one question made him look up. "Did Mr. Mercer ever tell you that your father was incompetent?" The attorney asked, mentally unstable, unable to handle his own affairs. "Yes," Daniel answered. "He said Dad was slipping, that he was not the man he used to be, that someone had to step in." His voice cracked on the last part. He swallowed and looked briefly in my direction. Our eyes met. There was no longer confusion there, just a quiet, heavy regret. Through it all, Mercer sat almost motionless. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced loosely in his lap, a faint hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. As if this were a minor inconvenience he would eventually smooth over with charm and paperwork. But as the hearing went on, something shifted. It was not dramatic. No raised voices, no sudden outbursts. Just a slow change in the way people in that room looked at him. The judge's gaze sharpened. The branch manager from the bank fidgeted in his seat, unable to look toward him. Even his own attorney began to flip through his notes with a kind of growing unease. I watched Mercer adjust his cufflink for the third time. A small movement, the gesture of a man who is used to control and feels it slipping, even if only by an inch. I sat still, hands folded on the table in front of me. The papers that carried my stolen name rested between us. But for the first time, they did not feel like weapons aimed at my chest. They felt like evidence being pried from his hands. The judge called for a short recess. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, a sharp knock that made a few people flinch. Chairs scraped as everyone stood. Conversations broke out in low murmurs. I remained seated a moment longer, letting the noise roll past me. On the other side of the aisle, Mercer turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room, calculating. For a brief second they landed on me. The confidence there had thinned just enough for me to recognize it. I exhaled slowly and rose, the bench creaking under my weight. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting clear light on every face, every paper, every lie brought into that room. For the first time since this began, I felt less like a man being erased and more like a man being written back in. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet for a moment. Then the doors opened again and the bailiff called everyone back inside. I walked toward my seat with the same steady pace I had carried through the morning, but there was a new tightness in the room. People spoke in low whispers, papers rustled faster than before. It felt like the air knew something was about to snap. I sat down beside Mark. He slid a sheet of notes toward me, but I barely glanced at it. My eyes drifted to Daniel. He sat alone now, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed together like he was holding himself still through force of will. He did not look up. The judge returned to the bench. She settled in, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room. Her presence calmed the noise immediately. When she signaled for testimony to continue, the courtroom slipped back into order, but the edges of that order felt thin. Mark rose and began addressing the judge. His voice carried clean and even through the room. He spoke about coercion. He spoke about patterns of manipulation. He spoke about a man inserting himself into a broken family and reshaping it for his own benefit. I watched the words land like small weights on a scale that had already begun tipping. Mercer sat across from us with his attorney back straight, jaw tight. His hands were clasped together on the table, knuckles pale. Every few seconds he adjusted his cufflink with a sharp twist, as if holding on to the last thread of control. Mark continued. He spoke of forged documents, of hospital rooms, of signatures stolen while medication blurred memory. The judge listened. The gallery listened. Even the fluorescent lights hummed more quietly. Mercer's attorney shifted in his seat. He opened his mouth as if to object, then thought better of it. His eyes kept flicking toward his client, measuring something he did not like. Mark finished and stepped back. The judge nodded, turning her attention to Mercer's side of the room. She asked if they wished to respond. Mercer's attorney straightened his jacket and attempted a calm rebuttal. He spoke of misunderstandings, of imperfect families, of attempts to help that were now being misread. He had practiced the tone, but it came out thin. He tried to continue, but Mercer suddenly leaned toward him and whispered something. The attorney stiffened. He put a hand on Mercer's arm as if to signal caution. Mercer jerked away. The attorney's expression shifted from control to alarm. The judge noticed the movement. She fixed her gaze on Mercer. "Sir, maintain order in the court." Mercer rose. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but like a spring uncoiling. His chair slid backward and hit the wall with a thud that startled the clerk. A woman in the gallery gasped. Someone dropped a pen that clattered across the tile and rolled in a crooked circle. Mercer's voice cut through the room. He was never there. The words cracked open the silence. He stepped forward, chest heaving, his arm flung out toward me. "Not once. I took that boy to baseball. I paid for his braces. I paid for his college. I answered his calls. I was the father he needed." The force of it hit the air like a blow. Daniel's head dropped lower, his shoulders curled inward. A man behind him muttered under his breath, and the bailiffs shifted their stance, ready. Mercer kept going. His voice shook with rage or pain or something tangled between the two. While he drove trucks and chased paychecks, I was the one who showed up. Me, not him. His attorney tried to grab his sleeve. Mercer tore his arm free. The judge struck her gavel, once a sharp crack that made several people flinch. "Order. Sit down now." Mercer ignored her. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He turned his glare toward me, eyes burning with the conviction of someone who had rewritten an entire life in his own image. "You abandoned him. You left all that space. Someone had to fill it." His voice echoed across the walls, raw and unfiltered. The judge struck her gavel again, louder this time. Bailiff stepped forward with cautious steps. Mark touched my arm, a small gesture asking me to stay seated, but something inside me steadied. I rose, not fast, not with heat, just enough to meet the moment standing. The room went still again. I looked at Mercer, and even from across the aisle I could see something in his expression falter. I spoke quietly, the words moving through the cold air between us with a weight I had carried for years. "He is right." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Mercer blinked, thrown off balance by the calm of it. I was not there enough. There were years I cannot take back, years I missed, years I should have been the one driving him to games and meetings and everything a boy remembers. I let the room hold the truth for a breath, but that does not give you the right to steal my estate, and it does not give you the right to steal my family. The judge called for immediate order. Mercer's face contorted, the anger there collapsing into something smaller, almost frightened. The bailiff stepped in on either side of him. Mark approached the lectern again. He spoke evenly, his voice filling the room with the precision of a closing argument. "Your Honor, the outburst speaks to undue influence and long-term manipulation." His own words confirm financial control, emotional leverage, and coercive behavior. The judge leaned back, fingers drumming once against the wooden bench. Then she delivered her decision. Her voice was cool, firm, and final. "The court will proceed with a criminal investigation into forgery, elder, financial abuse, extortion, and fraudulent transfers." Brooke covered her mouth with one hand. Tears fell freely now. She whispered through them, the words barely escaping. "John, I am sorry. I did not see who he was." I met her eyes. There was remorse there, heavy and real. I felt no anger left for her, only a quiet emptiness that had taken the place of blame. The bailiffs guided Mercer toward the back doors of the courtroom. He went reluctantly, each step smaller than the last. Just before he disappeared through the doorway, he twisted to look at me. His eyes were stripped of confidence, replaced by a hollow disbelief. The doors closed behind him with a solid, echoing sound. The judge dismissed the room, papers shuffled, chairs scraped, voices returned in small bursts. But Daniel stayed seated, shoulders hunched, hands motionless on his knees. I walked toward the aisle. He looked up as I passed just for a moment. His eyes met mine with a mixture of guilt and something softer. Something that felt like the first unbroken thread between us in a long time. I did not speak. Neither did he. The silence carried more truth than any words we could have exchanged. I stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of old paper and polished floors. Behind me, the courtroom door eased shut with a gentle click. I stood by the wall for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle. The corridor stretched quiet and empty ahead of me, a long line leading toward whatever waited next. I took one slow breath and let it out, feeling the echo of the gavel still fading in the back of my mind. The corridor behind me settled into silence, the kind that stays with a man even after he steps out into open air. I walked down the courthouse steps and felt the cold lift against my face. A steady winter breeze moving through the bare trees along the sidewalk. The sky above Springfield carried that soft gray light that comes before dusk, gentle and familiar. The kind that makes everything feel a little quieter inside. The next weeks passed with a slow, careful rhythm. Papers were reviewed, signatures, verified, accounts corrected. Each time Mark called, he spoke with that grounded ease of his, letting me know another piece had fallen back into place. When the final transfer returned to my name, I read the letter twice, not because I doubted it, but because the stillness that followed felt larger than any victory I had expected. Mercer remained in the county jail off West Division Street. His name appeared once on the news, a blurred image of him being escorted down a narrow hallway. I watched only long enough to recognize the slope of his shoulders, then turned off the television. There was nothing more in that story I needed to see. One evening, just as the sky dropped into full dark, a knock sounded at my front door. It was soft, careful, as if the person on the other side feared pressing too hard might undo something fragile. I opened the door and saw Daniel standing there. His jacket collar lifted against the cold, his hands tucked into the pockets. Shoulders pulled in the way a man holds himself when he is unsure if he belongs. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Dad, if you will have me, I want to try again." The words carried no ceremony. They were simple, honest, a little shaky at the end. I stepped aside, letting the warm air drift past me into the night. He hesitated for a heartbeat, eyes tracing the living room behind me like he was searching for signs that he was welcome. Then he stepped inside. I handed him a cup of coffee, and when our fingers brushed for a brief moment, I felt the tremor in his hand. He settled at the kitchen table, glancing around like he expected to find old ghosts waiting in the corners. I sat across from him. The room felt different with him in it, as if the space had been waiting for this wait to return. We talked in the quiet way men do when they are building bridges without naming the work. He asked if I was still doing woodwork in the garage. I asked how the new site was treating him. He told me my granddaughter had memorized her Christmas song for school. I told him the coffee pot was new because the old one had burned out last month. Small things, ordinary things, but each one felt like a plank laid over old water. He left late that night. When the door closed behind him, the quiet that remained was not loneliness. It was something gentler. Snow returned to Springfield as December settled in. On Christmas Eve, Daniel invited me to his new apartment. I brought a pie from the bakery on Jefferson Avenue and walked up the stairs with the slow care of someone stepping into a place he did not want to disturb. When Daniel opened the door, warm light spilled into the hallway and the sound of my granddaughter's laughter drifted toward me like an old memory returning. Inside near the Christmas tree sat my old leather armchair. The stitching at the right arm had been repaired. The surface had been polished. It stood there with a quiet pride angled toward the lights as if it had always belonged in that room. My granddaughter ran toward me, her feet thudding softly on the carpet. "Santa said this chair is Papa's forever." Her voice rose with that bright certainty only a child can hold. I lifted her into my arms and carried her toward the tree. The warmth of the room wrapped around us. Daniel watched from the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, eyes soft with something unspoken. I lowered myself into the chair. The leather gave a familiar sound beneath me, a creak that reached back through years I thought were lost. It felt the same, yet I could feel the difference in myself. The man sitting there now was not the man who had once let so much distance grow between him and his family. Brooke sat quietly near the table, hands folded in her lap. When our eyes met, she offered a small nod, unsure and humble. I returned it with a steady one of my own. Forgiveness does not always arrive with words. Sometimes it sits in the space between people and waits to be acknowledged. The evening moved gently. My granddaughter showed me her favorite ornament, a small silver bell that chimed softly when she shook it. My grandson crawled along the rug with a wooden truck, the wheels thumping in uneven rhythms. The smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Laughter rose and settled and rose again, filling the apartment like a slow tide. A week after the holiday, I met with a local nonprofit director downtown. The office was small, with old wooden floors and a window that looked out onto the courthouse lawn. Together we drafted the first pages of the Reeves Integrity Fund, a simple effort to help seniors who found themselves facing the kind of shadows I had walked through. I signed the papers without hesitation. Sometimes a man knows when a fight has given him something worth passing forward. Later that afternoon, I drove to Daniel's place again. When I stepped inside, the tree was still up, though the lights had dimmed from being used night after night. My grandson sat on the floor, stacking wooden blocks, steadying each one with the concentration only a child can summon. He looked up when he heard me and smiled, a small, unguarded gesture that warmed the room. I sat back in my chair. The leather held me with a familiar weight. The room breathed around me in soft, easy rhythms. I watched my family move through the space, each person carrying their own quiet story, and felt a calm I had not known in years. Outside, a faint wind pressed against the window, stirring the branches of a nearby tree. The lights on the porch cast a warm glow across the snow. I listened to the sound of my grandson's blocks tapping together, steady and sure, and let the moment settle into place. Justice, I realized, is not loud. It lives in the stillness that comes after a long fight, in the doors that open again, in the rooms you step back into without fear. I stayed there, resting in the quiet, feeling the warmth of the chair beneath my hands, knowing that for the first time in a long while I had come home to something worth keeping.